What if being unmarried isn't what you think it is? We've been told in 100 different ways that being alone means something is wrong, that if you're not married to someone, you're somehow incomplete, that love, marriage, a wife, these are the markers of a life well lived, a man worth knowing. Society doesn't just suggest this, it insists on it. Through films where the hero always gets married in the final scene, through family dinners where the first question is still, when are you getting married? Through friends who look at you with a soft kind of pity when you say you're unmarried, as if you've admitted to losing something precious, something every other man has managed to hold on to. But here's the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. What if being unmarried isn't a void waiting to be filled? What if it isn't absence at all, but leverage? Because there's a version of this conversation that nobody is having. Not in the movies, not at the dinner table, not in the self-help books that always end with someone finding their wife. The version where being unmarried is not a problem to be solved, where it's a phase to be used, where the man who chooses or finds himself choosing to stay single for a while might actually be making the most strategic decision of his life. That's what we're going to talk about. Let's start with the illusion, the idea that you need a wife to be whole. This belief runs so deep that most men have never even examined it. It came from somewhere, from the stories you watched as a child, from the culture that surrounded you before you had the language to question it, from the invisible timeline that gets handed to you early on. Study, work, find a wife, settle. That's the sequence. And if you deviate from it, if you're somewhere in your 20s or 30s or beyond without a wife, there's this quiet pressure that follows you everywhere, not always spoken, but felt in the questions, in the comparisons, in the way people phrase it. You haven't found a wife yet, as if getting married is the destination, and everything else is just waiting. Here's the crack in that narrative. The belief that you need a wife to be whole assumes that you arrive incomplete, that you are on your own, a half, and that the work of your life is to find the woman who makes you function. But what if you were already whole? What if the search for a wife to complete you was always, from the very beginning, solving the wrong problem? The quietest realization you can have is this: the men who know themselves deeply, who have sat with their own thoughts long enough to understand what they actually want, these men don't go looking for a wife to complete them. They go looking, eventually, for someone to add to what they've already built. That's a fundamentally different posture, and it starts, almost always, with time spent alone. Now, before we go further, I want to make a distinction that matters enormously. Being unmarried is not the same as being empty. These two things get collapsed into each other all the time, and it's one of the great confusions of our era. Loneliness is real. Emotional deprivation is real. The hunger for connection is one of the most human experiences that exists. I'm not here to romanticize isolation or pretend that solitude is always comfortable. It isn't. But there is a version of being unmarried that is entirely different from loneliness. It is a space, not an absence. It is quiet, not hollow. It is the state of a man who has chosen, consciously or by circumstance, to turn inward for a while, to tend to himself, to understand what he is made of before he hands pieces of himself over to someone else. The difference between a man who's unmarried and a man who's empty is not the presence of a wife. It's what he is doing with the silence. One man experiences solitude as a wound. The other experiences it as a room where he finally has space to think. Both feel lonely sometimes, but only one of them is building something in that quiet, and that distinction changes everything. Let's talk about energy, because this is something that rarely gets said out loud, and it should. Marriage costs energy, not just the big dramatic moments, the arguments, the reconciliations, the crises. Those are obvious. What men underestimate is the baseline cost, the constant low-level negotiation of being married, the adjustments you make 100 times a day without even noticing, the way your attention gets split, your focus gets redirected, your emotional bandwidth gets allocated to managing a household with another human being who has her own needs, her own fears. her own demands on the shared space between you. None of this is a criticism of marriage. It's just physics. Two people in a shared orbit create friction. That friction can be beautiful. It can refine you, challenge you, grow you in ways that solitude never could, but it is also constant. It does not stop. When you are unmarried, something shifts. Your attention is entirely your own. Your time is not divided. The decisions you make about how to spend your energy, where to direct it, how long to sustain it, when to rest, these are entirely in your hands. And if you are the kind of man who has serious things he wants to build, serious work he wants to do, serious growth he is trying to achieve, that kind of uninterrupted attention is not a small thing. It is a tremendous resource. Some of the most productive periods of men's lives are their unmarried years, not because being unmarried makes you more capable, but because the conditions are different. You are not diluting yourself. You are working with your full reservoir, and connected to that, the freedom to build without negotiation. When you're not married, you do not have to bring anyone else into your decisions. Your vision does not need to be adjusted to fit a wife's comfort. Your timeline is yours. Your direction is yours. The life you're constructing does not need to be co-designed. Now, I know what this sounds like. It sounds cold. It sounds selfish. And I want to be honest. Building with a woman who's genuinely aligned with you is one of the most powerful things two people can do together. That's real. That matters. But here is what also matters. Most men are not in that kind of marriage. Most married men are constantly trimming their vision to fit their wife's comfort, where they are quietly stalling their ambitions to preserve a peace that doesn't fully work, where they make decisions not from their own deepest sense of direction, but from a negotiated middle ground that leaves both people partially satisfied and neither person fully alive. I have watched men slow their entire lives down to maintain a marriage that wasn't worthy of the cost. I have watched men abandon cities, careers, ideas, versions of themselves, all in service of a marriage that eventually ended anyway. And when it ended, they were left not just without a wife, but without the time they had given, the direction they had surrendered, the momentum they had sacrificed. Being unmarried is a life with fewer constraints. It is a life where direction belongs entirely to you, and that is, in the right hands, a construction site with no unnecessary delays. There is also a risk dimension that almost never gets discussed honestly. Marriage carries real risks, not just emotional ones, though those are significant, but financial risks, psychological risks, the kind of deep structural disruption that a divorce can cause in a man's life. We tend to talk about divorce as an emotional event, as heartbreak, as sadness, but the honest accounting of a marriage that ends badly includes time lost, assets divided, social networks disrupted, living situations upended, mental energy consumed for years before and after the end, and for many men, devastating financial consequences that follow them for decades. None of this means marriage isn't worth it. Of course it can be. But it does mean that the choice to stay unmarried, especially during a phase of life where you are building something, where your foundation is still being laid, is not only emotionally understandable, it is strategically sound. The unmarried man is not exposed to those losses. He is operating in a lower risk environment. And in a season of life where clarity and momentum matter most, minimizing unnecessary disruption is not cowardice, it's wisdom. Then there is something deeper, something that gets to the core of who you are: emotional independence, the ability to regulate your own inner state, to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for someone to soothe it, to feel uncertainty and not require reassurance, to be happy, genuinely, sustainably happy, without it depending on a wife's mood, a wife's presence, a wife's validation of who you are. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily rare. Most married men have never developed this capacity because they have never had to. The moment something feels difficult internally, there is a wife to lean on, to process with, to hand the weight over to, and that can feel like intimacy, and sometimes it is, but it can also become dependency, a subtle, slow erosion of a man's ability to stand on his own ground. Being unmarried forces a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that nothing else quite replicates. You learn to sit with yourself, to navigate your own darkness without a flashlight borrowed from someone else, to find stability not in a wife's certainty, but in your own capacity to endure uncertainty and still function. The men who come through this period, who genuinely develop this inner steadiness, they carry it with them into every decision they eventually make. They do not bring need into their lives. They bring choice, and that changes everything about the quality of what gets built. There is a quieter advantage too, one that takes longer to understand. When you're married, you adapt. This is natural. This is what living with a wife requires. You adjust your communication style, your preferences, your habits, your presentation of yourself to fit the shared space. Some of this adaptation is growth. You are genuinely improved by the influence of someone who sees the world differently than you do. But some of it is distortion. Some of it is the slow, unconscious editing of your own personality to avoid friction, to maintain harmony, to be acceptable to a wife whose acceptance you have decided matters more than your own direction. Over time, without realizing it, you can drift from yourself. You can find that the man you are after years of marriage is not quite the man you were before it, not more evolved, just altered in ways you didn't choose. Being unmarried removes that pressure. It gives you access to the raw, unfiltered version of yourself, the preferences that are entirely yours, the rhythms that belong to you alone, the thoughts you think when no one is listening, the values you hold when there is no one to perform them for. This is where real self-knowledge comes from, not from describing yourself to a therapist or writing in a journal, though those help, but from living, day after day, with only yourself as company, and discovering what you're actually like when no one is watching, who you are, underneath the adaptation. And solitude has one more quality that rarely gets mentioned in this context. It is a mirror. When you are unmarried, there is nowhere to hide. The habits you have, the useful ones and the destructive ones, become visible. The discipline you lack or possess, the way you spend your evenings when there is no wife to answer to, the relationship you have with your own mind when it is not distracted by someone else's. Marriage can, in certain ways, let you avoid yourself. The noise of domestic life masks the quiet signals that your own life is sending you. When you're alone, that noise disappears. And what remains is a very honest picture of who you actually are versus who you've been telling yourself you are. This is uncomfortable. It is also irreplaceable. The man who can sit in that discomfort, who can look at himself clearly without flinching, and then choose to improve, to build, to discipline himself, not because a wife is watching, but because he has decided to, that man becomes formidable over time, not because solitude made him better, but because he used the honesty that solitude offered. Let's talk about the long game. Time spent investing in yourself compounds, not metaphorically, literally. The skills you build this year become the foundation for opportunities next year. The clarity you develop about what you want shapes every decision that follows. The standards you raise, the habits you establish, the identity you construct, these don't reset, they accumulate, they multiply. The man who spends 3 years in a marriage that costs him more than it gives him is not just losing 3 years, he's losing the compounded return on what those 3 years could have produced if the energy had been directed inward. That is a calculation that rarely gets made, honestly. This is not an argument for permanent bachelorhood. It is an argument for using your unmarried years well while you have them, for treating this season of your life, if you are single, not as a waiting room, but as a workshop, a place where you are actively building something: skills, perspective, discipline, self-knowledge, the kind of interior infrastructure that will quietly determine the trajectory of everything that comes after. And there is something that happens to your standards when you do this work. When you are not afraid of being unmarried, when you have genuinely built a life that feels purposeful and self-sustaining, your criteria for what you are willing to accept from a woman changes completely. You stop choosing from scarcity. You stop tolerating things you know aren't right. because the alternative feels like being alone forever. You stop rushing into marriage because staying single feels like failure. Instead, you wait, not passively. You live, you grow, you continue building. But you wait for a woman who is genuinely worth choosing, and when she appears, you recognize her more clearly than you would have before, because you know yourself well enough to know what actually fits. This is one of the strangest paradoxes of intentional solitude. The man who's least afraid of staying unmarried is often the one most capable of building a genuinely good marriage, if he ever chooses to, because he is choosing from completeness, not desperation, from strength, not scarcity, from preference, not fear. There comes a moment, if you do this honestly, when your relationship with your own solitude shifts. It stops being something you're enduring. It stops being the space before marriage. It becomes, slowly and then all at once, something you recognize as an active phase, a period of construction, a time when the foundations are being poured, the walls are going up, the structure is taking shape, not in spite of being unmarried, but partly because of it. This is the turning point. When you stop comparing your solitude to other men's marriages, when you stop experiencing being unmarried as something that is happening to you and start experiencing it as something you are using. When your reference point shifts from what you don't have to what you're becoming, the urgency disappears. The quiet anxiety of being unchosen fades. What replaces it is something steadier, a low, consistent hum of purpose, the sense that you are somewhere you're meant to be, doing something that matters, even if the something is simply becoming. And with that shift comes a quality that is almost impossible to manufacture, a kind of quiet confidence, not the loud, performative kind that needs an audience, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you carry into rooms without explaining, the kind that comes from a man who has spent real time with himself and come out the other side with genuine respect for who he is. People feel this quality. It communicates without words. It is the opposite of the anxious seeking that comes from a man who needs a wife to feel complete, to feel like a man, to feel like his life has started. And ironically, it tends to attract, not because attraction is the goal, but because there is something magnetic about a man who is genuinely self possessed, who does not need you to feel whole, who is choosing rather than grasping. This confidence is not inherited. It is built, mostly in quiet rooms, mostly in the unglamorous work of living with yourself, long enough to stop being afraid of what you find. But I want to be honest with you here, because this conversation would be incomplete without it. Solitude can be misused. The qualities I've been describing, the independence, the self sufficiency, the focus, the inner calm, these are real, and they are available, but they require something that is not guaranteed. They require that you are actually using the time to build, and not simply hiding. There is a version of staying unmarried that is not strategic. It is a comfort zone dressed up as freedom. It is avoiding commitment not because you are intentionally investing in yourself, but because commitment feels risky, and this feels safe. It is isolation disguised as discipline, stagnation dressed as the bachelor lifestyle. The difference is in what you are actually doing with the quiet. Are you building? Are you growing? Are you pushing against your own edges? Developing your capacities? Expanding your understanding of what you are capable of? Or are you simply not engaging? Waiting in a low risk environment without using the low risk to take on anything meaningful? This is the question you have to answer honestly, because only you know the truth of it. And the answer determines whether your unmarried years are a season of construction or just a long pause. Which brings us to the deepest version of what all of this is pointing toward, the idea of becoming someone before you invite a woman into your life. Not as a rigid rule, not as a philosophy that tells you marriage can only happen after some impossible threshold of self development has been crossed, but as a genuine question worth sitting with. What would it mean to arrive at marriage as a man who has already built something? Not a finished product. No man is ever that. But a man with a foundation, with self knowledge, with a genuine sense of what he values, what he wants, where he is going. Because the alternative is arriving at marriage as a construction site asking a wife to navigate the dust and the uncertainty and the ongoing renovation of a man who is still figuring out how to be one. Sometimes that works. Great marriages have been built in messier circumstances than that, but often it doesn't. Often two people find each other before either of them is ready, and the marriage becomes the primary arena of both their self-development, which is exhausting and fragile and usually impermanent. There is another option: to do the interior work first, to let the years of being unmarried, however many they are, for however long they last, become the years of construction, so that if you do choose to marry, you are not bringing a woman a half-finished story and asking her to write the ending. You are bringing her something sturdy, something considered, a man who was already whole before she arrived. So let me return to where we started. Is being unmarried a curse? Is it the thing that the world has told you it is? A gap in the resume of your life? An indication of something missing? A problem that needs solving before you can be taken seriously as a man? Or is it something else entirely? Here is what I believe. Being unmarried, real, intentional, honest solitude, is not a void. It is a preparation phase. It is the part of the process that most men rush through, or suffer through, or try to end as quickly as possible without ever understanding what it was offering them. It is the time when you learn who you actually are, when you build the habits that will determine your future, when you develop the emotional independence that will make you capable of genuine strength rather than just desperate companionship, when you raise your standards high enough to actually mean something, when you compound your investments in yourself quietly, day by day, while other men are busy negotiating with their wives about what to have for dinner. None of this means you should stay unmarried forever. None of this means marriage is not worth building. Of course it can be. But there is a difference between choosing marriage because you're ready, because you have something to bring, because you know who you are, because you are genuinely adding rather than completing, and choosing it because the silence got too uncomfortable to sit with. The man who can sit with the silence, who can use it, who can build inside it. That man does not stay small. He does not arrive at his future breathless and half-formed. He arrives having done the work that most men never do, in the time that most men simply wait through. So here is the only question that matters, the one I want to leave you with, not as a challenge, not as a judgment, but as an honest invitation to look at your own life clearly. Are you unmarried, or are you becoming the kind of man most men never take the time to become?